Somewhere inside the Invictus organization right now, in meetings that will almost certainly never be publicly reported in full detail, people are apparently having a conversation that would have been genuinely unthinkable a decade ago when this whole project first began.
Prince Harry and Invictus. His games could get cancelled.
Who should actually be the face of this organization if not Harry himself? Names like David Beckham and Mike Tindall have reportedly been floated, half as a joke at first according to the reporting that has surfaced, as people who could plausibly front the games without dragging along the same accumulated weight that Harry currently carries into every single headline connected to Invictus at this point. Whether either man would actually want that particular role, given absolutely everything currently swirling around the organization's public image and reputation, is a completely separate and genuinely open question that nobody directly involved has answered publicly as of now. But the fact that the question has been raised at all, seriously enough to circulate through actual reporting rather than remaining confined to idle online speculation, tells you the brand problem sitting underneath this organization has become considerably bigger and more structural than any single funding shortfall or any single isolated bad news cycle could fully account for.
He still believes that it's his place to lecture the world.
Let me walk you through how the organization actually arrived at this specific point, step by step, because I think the shape of this problem is worth understanding properly and in sequence, rather than just absorbing it passively as another undifferentiated round of Sussex criticism that blurs together with everything else circulating in this story right now.
This is seismic. This is the biggest royal story of the year. Invictus is Harry. Harry is Invictus.
Yeah.
And you're telling me it could be cancelled.
Could be.
This, I mean, I promise you, other than some physical problem like illness or whatever, this is the worst thing that could happen to Harry.
Yeah.
Invictus launched in 2014 as one of the most genuinely well-regarded things attached to Harry's name at any point in his public life. A real cause, personally motivated by his own experience visiting wounded service members recovering from serious injuries, built patiently and with real care over the following decade into something with genuine international standing and genuine credibility among veteran communities across multiple countries. It has taken considerably less than that same decade to put that hard-won reputation under the level of sustained pressure it is currently facing from multiple directions at once.
Boeing, massive, huge company, not a company who are short of a few bob, they pulled out. They sponsored last year's and the year before that. They pulled out of Birmingham. So that's one huge sponsor already out. Part of Harry coming to Birmingham this week, yeah, he was supposed to go and see his dad. He was supposed to have the kids. Well, his other main reason was for the Invictus launch is to go and have meetings to try and drum up more support, drum up more sponsorship. And it's not going so well.
Boeing, a company that spends genuine months running detailed internal brand safety reviews before attaching its name to anything of this particular scale and public visibility, quietly closed its file on future involvement with the games rather than renewing what had previously been publicly described as a long-term, multi-year partnership arrangement. Australia's government confirmed in its most recent budget that it is finished funding Invictus Australia specifically, even while simultaneously increasing broader veteran spending elsewhere in that same budget cycle, meaning this was not a government going cold on veterans as a category, but a targeted decision about this particular organization specifically. A senior and genuinely highly credentialed board member with decades of relevant governance experience stepped down without any public explanation being offered at all. The kind of quiet, unexplained departure that tends to speak considerably louder in this world than any formal public statement ever could.
I think it's really Meghan. He's under, I said in my book, Betrayal, that he was brainwashed by Meghan. And of course, he continues to be brainwashed by her.
And somewhere inside that same general stretch of weeks, entirely separately from any Invictus-specific issue, Harry lost the largest and most consequential court case of his entire year. None of these individual developments, taken entirely on its own, proves anything definitive about the organization's future trajectory. Together, as a pattern unfolding across a genuinely compressed time frame, they describe something that the people actually responsible for signing sponsorship checks and allocating corporate marketing budgets have been reading carefully and responding to for months now, through their signatures on renewed contracts or through the increasingly conspicuous absence of those signatures when renewal time comes around.
Have Prince Harry and Meghan Markle dragged Invictus Games down with them? Recent information about the Invictus Games Foundation and its Endeavor Fund have come to light and are painting a really bad picture of the situation. Invictus Games began with a profoundly noble mission to use sport to help recovery for wounded veterans. But lately, the math isn't mathing on their mission and the way that they run their foundation and program.
Here is the comparison that I think cuts closest to the actual heart of this problem, and it is one that gets raised considerably less often than it probably should in the general coverage of this ongoing story. William did not have to build Earthshot around his own personal story or his own personal biography to make it land with the public and with corporate sponsors. 5 years into that specific project, it is still funding real, named, measurable environmental projects around the world, distributed across multiple countries and multiple categories of environmental challenge, and nobody in the sponsorship world is seriously asking whether Earthshot can survive being associated with William, specifically as an individual. The prize exists somewhat independently of William as a personality. He chairs it, he appears prominently at its annual events, he lends his profile to its visibility, but the controversies of his personal life, whatever they may be at any given moment, do not automatically become Earthshot's controversies in the way that Harry's ongoing personal legal troubles have become functionally inseparable from Invictus coverage at every level. That is the structural difference between these two royal-adjacent charitable ventures, and I think it explains considerably more about the current Invictus funding crisis than any single sponsor's individual decision does in isolation.
Now, this is seismic. This is the biggest royal story of the year. This is an unmitigated disaster for Harry. This is a nightmare on wheels. This is catastrophic. And the reason why is because Invictus is all he's got. We know that the public speaking work has dried up.
When your own name is the brand, when the founder's personal story is not simply the origin point of the cause but remains years later, the primary lens through which every subsequent headline about the cause gets filtered and interpreted by the public, your bad headlines inevitably become the brand's bad headlines, whether the athletes actually competing had anything whatsoever to do with generating them or not. A wounded veteran preparing to compete at the Birmingham Games has no control at all over Harry's court case, his ongoing security dispute with the British government, the state of his marriage, or any of the other threads currently generating coverage around him personally. But that specific veteran's actual funding for travel and accommodation and equipment is directly and measurably affected by how those completely unrelated threads make corporate sponsors feel about renewing a check they might otherwise have signed without hesitation. If this breakdown is useful to you, the like button helps this channel keep doing this kind of analysis instead of just repeating headlines. Hit it and stay with me, because there is a wider pattern connecting Invictus to other Harry-associated causes that I think deserves its own moment of attention before we get to the internal criticism.
Then there's Tindall, another good charity that Harry lost control of following a bitter public row with Sophie Chandauka, who now controls the charity. It was his charity that he lost control of. And then there's the Archwell Philanthropies, or Foundation, or whatever it's called this week. Which has effectively been shuttered.
Invictus is not the only Harry-linked charitable cause currently experiencing a genuinely difficult stretch, and I think the pattern across multiple organizations is doing a considerable amount of the explanatory work here on its own. Tindall, the charity Harry co-founded specifically in memory of his mother, and that has always carried a deep personal significance for him beyond almost anything else in his charitable portfolio, went through a very public and genuinely painful rupture recently, with Harry ultimately stepping back from his role as patron amid a serious dispute with the organization's chair. I want to be careful here, because that specific situation is not proof of mismanagement on Harry's part specifically, and it would be genuinely unfair to state otherwise based purely on the public reporting currently available. But it is one more entry in a growing file that sponsors, corporate partners, and potential future collaborators are increasingly reading in full, rather than reading each individual controversy in isolation, as though it existed in a vacuum separate from everything else. The people currently deciding where to allocate their sponsorship budgets this particular year are reading that entire file, not simply the Invictus chapter of it in isolation from everything else connected to Harry's broader charitable involvement. And when a pattern starts to emerge across multiple separate organizations, each with its own specific and largely unrelated set of triggering events, the red that a sophisticated corporate sponsor eventually arrives at is rarely about any single organization's individual governance. It becomes instead a read about the common factor connecting all of them, which in this specific case happens to be Harry's own continued involvement and continued personal visibility.
Now, of course, Tom Bower in his recent book Betrayal alleged that Invictus funds were directed towards private jets, 5-star hotels, and transportation for Harry and Meghan.
Reports as recent as last year described competitors, the actual wounded and injured service members this entire event was created to serve, expressing genuine frustration that coverage of the games kept gravitating persistently toward Harry and Meghan instead of toward the athletes who were actually competing, training, and in many cases making remarkable recoveries directly in front of cameras that seemed more interested elsewhere. Some of these competitors reportedly threatened to withdraw over exactly that dynamic, which is a significant escalation from simple grumbling to active consideration of non-participation. Sit with what that specific detail actually means for a moment, because I genuinely think it deserves more than just a passing mention buried inside a longer list of grievances.
You know, you start looking into it and you're like, hey, what the heck is going on here? You know, those 535 competitors had to pay their own way. They had to pay their own housing for the games. They had to pay for their own equipment. And Harry and Meghan got a really nice vacation out of it with lots of adorational speeches and clapping and crowds gathered for them.
These are not outside critics with some pre-existing axe to grind against the Sussexes generally, the kind of commentary that fills royal forums regardless of the underlying facts. These are the intended beneficiaries of the entire organization, people who have been through genuinely serious combat or service-related injuries, genuinely difficult and often multi-year recoveries, people for whom this competition represents something significant in their own personal journey, feeling like supporting characters in their own competition, in an event that was specifically designed and built from the ground up to center their individual stories and their hard-won achievements above everything else. That is not a spreadsheet problem you can simply solve with better accounting practices or a revised communication strategy. That is the foundational purpose of the entire organization being quietly undermined, week by week, by the celebrity gravity surrounding its own founder. And if the competitors themselves, the actual veterans this whole thing exists for, are the ones raising this specific question, it becomes considerably harder for anyone to write off every other piece of external criticism as simple tabloid noise or reflexive anti-Sussex sentiment coming from people with no real stake in the outcome. There is a genuinely fair version of this story where Harry comes out looking considerably better, and I want to give it real space here rather than simply dismissing it in favor of the more critical reading I've been building toward. Harry's personal story. A man who visited wounded service members recovering in hospital was genuinely and visibly moved by what he witnessed there, and built something real and lasting directly from that specific emotional experience, is a genuine and significant part of why Invictus resonated with the public as strongly as it did in the first place, and why it attracted the level of international sponsorship and cross-national participation it achieved in its earlier, more successful years. Strip the founder's personal story out of the equation entirely, replace it with a more conventionally polished celebrity ambassador, and you risk losing exactly the raw emotional core that built the brand into something genuinely meaningful to people rather than just another charity gala circuit event. The people now quietly suggesting Beckham or Tindall as alternative faces for the organization are not necessarily proposing a better version of Invictus in any deep sense. They may simply be proposing a more commercially convenient and lower-risk version, stripped of the specific personal resonance and lived experience that made the original concept resonate as powerfully as it did with both the public and, crucially, with the veteran community itself. So what we are genuinely looking at here is a founder whose personal story built something real and lasting, running headlong into a set of largely unrelated personal controversies, the court cases, the security disputes, the ongoing family estrangement, that are now making it considerably harder for that same founder to lead the organization without inevitably pulling the whole thing into his own personal turbulence, whether he intends to or not. Reasonable people, including people who genuinely care about the underlying cause of supporting wounded veterans, land differently on which side of that specific tension should ultimately win out in practice. What is much harder to argue in good faith, regardless of where any individual observer lands on the fairness question, is that the tension itself is currently costing the games real, measurable, quantifiable money at the exact moment in the funding cycle when they can least afford to be losing any of it. Let me bring this down to the actual, concrete mechanics of what a funding shortfall means in practice, because I think the abstraction of that phrase, funding shortfall, makes it far too easy to lose sight of what is actually at stake here for real, individual people rather than for an abstract organizational balance sheet. A wounded veteran preparing to compete at Birmingham 2027 needs international flights booked well in advance, often for themselves and a support companion who assists with mobility, medical monitoring, or other specific accessibility needs that vary considerably from competitor to competitor. They need appropriate accommodation secured for the full duration of the games, often accommodation with specific accessibility requirements built in. They need medical assessments cleared well in advance of travel, sometimes multiple separate rounds of assessment depending on the nature of their specific competing event and the particular injury or condition they are managing. Every single one of those individual line items depends directly on sponsorship money that is currently being decided, one corporate boardroom at a time, in meetings that have essentially nothing to do with the veterans themselves as individuals, and everything to do with abstract brand safety reviews and reputational risk modeling connected specifically to Harry's ongoing personal situation, over which those veterans have no influence whatsoever. If that funding gap does not close meaningfully before 2027 finally arrives, the available options genuinely facing organizers at that point are not good ones, and organizers themselves have already publicly acknowledged as much in interviews and briefings. A smaller overall event with fewer total competitors able to participate. Fewer participating nations able to afford sending full teams, meaning some countries' veterans simply do not get the opportunity to compete at all. A shorter overall program with less time and fewer events for the athletes who do successfully attend. Or, in the most serious and most damaging scenario currently being discussed, an outright postponement that organizers have already conceded is genuinely on the table if current funding trends continue in their present direction without meaningful intervention. None of those potential outcomes touch Harry's own personal finances or his own separate commercial ventures and business interests in any direct or meaningful way whatsoever, regardless of how the situation ultimately resolves. All of them land squarely and exclusively on the people the foundation exists specifically to serve. The wounded and injured veterans who have already given considerably more than most people will ever be asked to give in service to their country, and who now find themselves waiting without much say in the matter to see whether an organization built specifically in their name and around their stories can actually deliver on its founding promise to them. There is also the quieter but genuinely revealing question of who actually wants to work for this organization at all right now in a professional capacity, which tells you something that competitor complaints and sponsor withdrawals do not fully capture on their own. Birmingham has reportedly struggled significantly to fill senior operational roles ahead of the 2027 games, with multiple qualified candidates reportedly turning down positions once they learned the specific role came with the word Invictus attached to their job title and their public professional identity, citing the organization's current reputation directly and explicitly as their stated reason for declining an otherwise attractive opportunity. That detail is not competitors losing faith in the underlying mission, which would be concerning enough on its own. That is professional staff, experienced people whose entire career depends on accurately reading reputational risk before committing years of their working life to any particular organization, independently and individually deciding that the specific exposure that comes with this particular role is not currently worth taking on, regardless of how genuinely they might feel about the underlying cause of supporting wounded veterans. None of this means the games are actually finished as a project, and I want to be genuinely and explicitly clear about that before we close this out, because it would be easy to walk away from everything I have just described with an unnecessarily grim outlook. There is still meaningful time remaining before 2027 arrives. There is still a real and plausible chance that new sponsors step in to fill the current funding gap, particularly if the organization manages to more clearly and deliberately separate its public messaging and its brand identity from Harry's personal legal and commercial situation going forward, rather than continuing to let the two blur together in coverage. There is still a genuine chance that his next few public appearances, handled carefully, shift the surrounding narrative in a more favorable direction rather than deepening the current pattern of association with controversy. Possibility genuinely still exists here in real, tangible terms, and it would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise just for the sake of a cleaner or more dramatic narrative. But possibility is not the same thing as actual momentum. And right now, the only currency that genuinely keeps an event of this scale and this operational complexity running at all, money, specifically corporate sponsorship money committed years in advance of the actual competition, is moving in one clear and consistent direction, and that direction is unmistakably away from Birmingham rather than toward it. Whether the organization can meaningfully reverse that trend before the current funding gap becomes operationally unmanageable, forcing organizers into one of the difficult scenarios already publicly acknowledged as being on the table, is the actual question that matters most here, considerably more than any individual controversy currently generating headlines on any given week. There is also a version of the future worth naming honestly and directly before we move on. One where the Beckham or Tindall conversation stops being a half-joke floated quietly in private conversations among staff and board members and becomes something considerably closer to an actual formal proposal discussed openly at board level with real consideration given to the practical logistics of such a transition. If that happens, it will represent a genuinely significant moment in this entire story, an acknowledgement, made explicitly rather than left implicit, that the organization's long-term survival may depend on a level of separation from its own founder that would have seemed genuinely unthinkable back in 2014, when Invictus first launched with Harry's personal story sitting right at its emotional and promotional center. Whether that separation, if it ever actually happens in any formal way, would successfully preserve what made the original concept work as powerfully as it did, or whether it would simply produce a more commercially palatable but ultimately less resonant and less emotionally compelling version of the same basic idea, is a genuinely open question that nobody currently involved in the organization seems fully prepared to answer out loud, at least not on the record, given how sensitive the entire topic remains internally. There is one more dimension worth naming, honestly, before we close this out, because I think it is genuinely uncomfortable and gets skipped past far too easily in most mainstream coverage of this specific story, in favor of the safer and more emotionally comfortable narrative. Tom Bauer's recent book contains allegations that Invictus-related funds were spent at various points around past games on private jet travel and five-star accommodation specifically for Harry and Meghan. I want to flag this honestly rather than treating it as settled fact. It has not been independently verified through any audit that I am aware of, and no supporting documentation has been made public to confirm or deny the specific claim. What is independently verifiable, however, purely through the charity's own published annual accounts rather than through any leaked document or anonymous source, is that spending has genuinely shifted over recent years toward the foundation's own internal operations and overhead relative to direct spending reaching veterans themselves on the ground. Whether that particular shift represents entirely ordinary organizational growth of the kind most maturing charities naturally experience as they scale up their operations, or something rather less flattering and considerably more concerning, is a fair and genuinely legitimate question for independent auditors and investigative journalists to keep asking persistently rather than letting it quietly drop out of the news cycle. It is exactly the kind of open, unresolved question that makes already cautious corporate sponsors considerably more cautious still, regardless of whether Bauer's specific allegation about jets and accommodation ultimately proves accurate or not once, and if it is ever fully investigated. What do you think? Does Invictus genuinely need to formally separate itself from Harry as the public face of the organization in order to survive commercially over the next several years and reach 2027 in a healthy financial position? Or does that specific kind of separation ultimately defeat the entire emotional purpose the organization was originally built around in the first place, back in 2014, when the founder's own personal story was quite literally the whole point of the exercise? Drop your take in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and they genuinely shape what we end up covering next on this channel going forward. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.